Hi, my name is Terence and welcome to Building Blocks English. This is the second part of the passive voice lesson. In the first part, we looked at the 6 reasons why we use the passive. And today, we're going to look at how we form the passive. Before we have a look at this, there are some important words that we also need to know. These words we use to describe parts of a sentence, much like the agent. But in this case here, these are the grammatical parts of a sentence. So, this might be a little bit of a revision for you. The verb is the action. Usually this is signified by the letter V. The subject is the person or thing that performs the action and sits in front of the verb in the sentence. This is usually represented as an S. Remember that the subject may or may not be the agent. The passive voice grammar is what determines who the agent is, or whether the agent is the subject or not. The object is the person or thing that receives or experiences the action and sits after the verb in the sentence. In this case, we're going to call it the O. Extra information is everything else. It is all other words outside of the subject, verb, and object. These are things that can give extra information like when something happens, who I did it with, or why, to name a few. Let's analyze one example sentence just to make sure that you understand. Ethan bought some flowers for Ella yesterday. Ethan is the subject because Ethan is performing the action and it is before the verb. The verb is bought and the object is some flowers because the flowers is the object that is experiencing the action by. Everything else is extra information. This is not necessary to make sense in the sentence, but it is nice to have because more information is good. So let's begin. The passive voice uses the following basic form: be plus past participle, or verb 3. If you see a be verb and you see a past participle, then you have a passive. There are no exceptions. Let's have a look at some examples. The man was arrested for stealing a television and a radio. Here we have a be and a past participle. So it is passive. The building was burnt down at 3 in the morning. Was burnt down. It was invented by Guglielmo Marconi. Was invented. It is said that he is the greatest guitarist to have ever lived. Is said. The passive can come in many different shapes and forms, but it is important to remember that there's always 2 parts: the be verb and the past participle. So how do we form the passive? So we want to know how to transform from an active sentence, this is where the subject is the agent, to a passive sentence, where the subject is not the agent. So let's use our example sentence. In the active, John bought the book at 2 p.m. The passive of this is the book was bought at 2 p.m. How did we do this? There is a very, very simple process that you can follow to be able to transform any active sentence to a passive sentence. Step 1. Identify the subject, the verb, and the object. In this case here, John is the subject, it's before the verb. The verb is bought. The book is the object because it experiences or receives the action. Everything else is extra information. 2. Make the object the subject. So we take the book and we put it into the subject position of our new sentence. 3. Add the be verb and change it to the desired tense. So let's look at the original tense, bought. This is past simple. So we're going to change the be verb to past simple. The past simple of be is was or were. But in this case here, we're going to use was because the book is singular. 4. Change the verb to past participle. So the verb is bought, which is past simple. The past participle of bought is also bought because the forms of buy are buy, bought, bought. So we have our past participle. Here's our PP. 5. Just copy and paste any extra information. So we know that the extra information here is at 2 p.m. because it just tells us when something happens. It's not necessary, but it's nice to have. So we're just going to copy and paste it at the end of the sentence. You can follow this process for almost any sentence, but you do need to make sure that you know your basic tenses. And that leads us to my next point. It's important to know how to form the passive using all basic tenses and common forms. You need to know your basic tenses because, remember, if you look at some of our other videos, basic tenses can really change the meaning of a sentence. You know that present simple is used for something very specific, so is past continuous is used for something else, past simple has another meaning, past continuous has another meaning, etc. So we want to maintain these meanings when we construct the passive. Let's start from the basics. 1. Present simple. The active sentence is tourists take a lot of photos here. The passive, a lot of photos are taken here. You can see that I've also got the form just below the name of the tense. Okay, so here I've got the form or the rule. Present simple is made up of is, are, or am plus past participle. Make sure that you use the right be verb for the right subject. Next, we have present continuous. Excuse the mess. We are doing up the kitchen. This is another word for renovating. In the passive, excuse the mess. This is extra information. It's not important. The kitchen is being done up. Is being done up. Here the rule is, are, or am plus being plus past participle. Remember that present continuous is made up of be plus verb ing, but then we also need to have a passive in front, which is be plus past participle. And that's why we have the first be here, and then plus verb ing, but in this case the verb ing is being because this is part of the passive, past participle. So if you think about it, this is the passive and this is the continuous. Clever, isn't it? Our next tense is present perfect. Actively, we have sold the house at a profit. In the passive, the house has been sold at a profit. Remember that present perfect has two parts, has or have plus past participle, and the passive here is the be plus past participle. Next, we have past simple. In the active, some burglars stole our television and laptop. In the passive, our television and laptop were stolen. The form here is was or were plus past participle. In the past continuous, they were painting our house at the time. In the passive, our house was being painted at the time. Again, this is one of the tricky tenses to construct. So we know that the continuous is made up of the was or were plus verb ing. This is the continuous. And the passive is the be plus past participle. Past perfect, in the active, she couldn't come because she had broken her arm. In the passive, she couldn't come because her arm had been broken. So again, this is another tricky tense because it has several parts to it. So we know that the past perfect component has a had plus past participle, and the passive component has the be plus past participle. Next, we have passives with modal verbs. Modal verbs include verbs like must, will, might, may, should, etc. For example, our neighbors might sell their house tomorrow. In the passive, their house might be sold tomorrow. The rule is really simple here. Modal plus be, and be literally be, plus past participle. Because if you remember, modal verbs are always followed by a base verb. That's the infinitive without to. For example, will go, may sleep, can drink. Using the be going to structure, which is often used to talk about the future. In the active, they are going to renovate the hotel soon. In the passive, the hotel is going to be renovated soon. The form of this is be going to plus the be verb plus past participle. The be verb in this case is going to be and always be, because it is part of the infinitive, to be. Next, we have verb patterns. Some verbs in English are followed by another verb that's in the ing form, and some verbs are followed by an infinitive. Okay, so for example, in our example sentence here, I hate people watching me. We know that hate is followed by an ing verb, like I hate swimming, or I hate going to the gym, or I hate waking up early. So it is possible to make some of these sentences passive. So the passive of I hate people watching me is I hate being watched. So we make sure that hate is still followed by an ing verb, and then that ing verb is going to be being in this case, and then the next verb is the past participle. So here we have the verb plus ing, which is what we call the verb pattern, and then we have the be plus pp, which is our passive. These can be quite difficult to construct, and these are some of the least common uses of the passive. So you don't have to worry too much about these. Lastly, the other verb pattern is the verb plus to infinitive. So for example, she would prefer people to call her Jackie. We know that the verb pattern of prefer is prefer someone to do something. Okay? So when we make the passive, we say she would prefer to be called Jackie. So here we have prefer plus infinitive and passive Jackie. So this part here is our verb pattern, verb plus infinitive, and then the second part there is our passive. These are all our basic tenses and common forms. It's quite a lot of information, so make sure that you watch this video again if you would like to see it again. But you can also check out very detailed information if you follow the link in the video description below, okay? Because it is a lot of information to take in. And don't forget, I will be uploading some practice materials that you can use to practice this grammar in the future. There are some things that I would like to say before I finish this video because there are some important points related to the passive that you also need to know. So, firstly, intransitive verbs are not used in the passive. An intransitive verb is a verb that does not have an object. There are a lot of verbs in English that don't have objects. For example, one is take off. In the example sentence, the plane took off in the morning. There is no object after takeoff. There is a time phrase, but remember, that's extra information and that's optional. So for example, many people died in the earthquake. Here, the verb is die. If we think about this, remember, the first step of making passive is to identify subject, verb, object. So, many people here is the subject, the verb is died, and then I have in the earthquake. This is not an object. This is extra information. In this case here, it's telling me where the people died. So this is just extra. There is no object. If you think about this point, what is the second point of the transformation process? You make the object the subject. But because there is no object, we cannot make a subject. So what do we do in cases like this? You're thinking, I have a formal text and I'd like to use the passive because it's more formal. Well, you have two choices. You either have to leave it in the active and don't do anything, or use a transitive synonym. So for example, a transitive synonym of die is the verb to kill. But we know that the verb to kill has an object because we usually say to kill somebody has an object. So our passive sentence of this is many people were killed in the earthquake. My second point is verbs with two objects can have two passive forms. So let's have a look at an active sentence. John gave Julie some flowers. If we analyze this sentence, we can see that we have John, subject, gave, verb, Julie, object, and some flowers, object. These two objects do have very, very specific names. They're not that important, but they're called the indirect object, which is Julie in this case. Usually the indirect object is the object that does not move. It is the stationary object. In this case here, flowers is the direct object because it is the object that moves between or passes between John and Julie, or the subject and the object. So in this case here, we can make two different passive structures. Option 1. It is more common to use the person as the subject or the indirect object. So we would say Julie was given some flowers if you followed the process. Option 2 is that we can use the thing as the subject, and this will emphasize the object here. Probably because we want to know what the object is, because we already know who the person is. So this passive sentence would look like, some flowers were given to Julie. And we have to use the to preposition here to indicate direction. And in this case here, to Julie is considered extra information because it's not exactly necessary for the sentence to make sense. Point 3. Don't forget your prepositions. Oh, we hate these little guys. There are some verbs in English that are just followed by a preposition. For example, Sam paid for the book. In this case here, we have the verb paid, and the verb pay is generally followed by the preposition for. If we look at the dictionary form, it would look like to pay for something. So when you create the passive, don't forget the preposition. It is really easy to forget it when we're learning how to construct and use the passive because we're worried and we're thinking so much about basic tenses, and we're thinking about what the past participle is, and we're thinking about what form of the verb be it should be, and then we forget the little guy for. Okay, so don't forget it. So the passive is the book was paid for, and they stay together. Don't forget him. In this case here, if you do forget the preposition, you're going to create an entirely different sentence that actually means something, but it means something different, and we don't want that. But that's just lucky. In most other cases, the sentence would not make sense at all. Okay? And that is the end of the lesson. As you can see, this is the longest video so far because this is a very, very meaty, substantial topic, but it is incredibly important. We cannot live life without using the passive. There are so many fixed expressions and natural expressions that we use in English that use the passive. For example, the most classic one is, where were you born? Oh, I was born in Brazil, for example. This is a passive sentence. We would never use this in the active because if you think about it, who is the agent? I want you to think about that. Okay? If you can tell me what the active of this sentence is, write it in the comments below. And you'll see why this sentence is a bit strange and why we prefer to use the passive instead. It's a big topic. The passive is used in all basic tenses and other common forms like verb patterns with modal verbs, with different future tenses, and you have to memorize all of these. So, if you'd like more information on this grammar topic, check out the link in the video description below. I'm going to create some practice materials in the near future for you to do, because this is something that you do need to practice, which in order to help you memorize the different forms. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like and subscribe, tell your friends, and I really hope to see you soon. Bye.